let's get into sex therapy concepts. And this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time in using these sex therapy concepts to apply what we've learned so far about fat phobia, and fat sex. So I did a workshop called Let's Talk About Sex Therapy, Common Problems and Solutions. And in constructing that workshop, I came up with my top 9 sex therapy concepts that I most commonly use when I'm doing sex therapy with clients. And so they are the dual control model, human sexual response model from Masters and Johnson, the sexual response cycle from Rosemary Basson, the idea of closeness and separateness as being on a continuum, which is related to Esther Perel, David Schnarch's work, defining what good sex actually means, and that's really taken from Barry McCarthy's work, trauma-informed treatment, which I think we want to talk about here in terms of this being traumatic experiences that then may or may not need a real trauma-informed approach. Attachment theory, we've already talked about a little bit. The EFT cycle, so emotionally focused therapy. I use a lot of EFT principles when I am helping couples. Of course, there is the emotionally focused individual therapy that has kind of just come out from Sue Johnson. There's not enough research yet to really understand what's different about doing EFIT versus the couples work, but that's being worked on, and there's some publications that are coming out on that. And then the final one is on love maps and arousal templates. So love maps, 2 different concepts. Love maps from John Money, but also love maps is a phrase that the Gottmans use. So let's start with Masters and Johnson's human sexual response. So this is the first model that really came out about how humans are supposed to respond sexually. So we're supposed to get desire out of something spontaneous. Then we go into arousal, and then we orgasm, maybe a few times if we're lucky, and then back down to refractory period and resolution. So this model has nothing to do with context. It assumes that if you don't have desire, you have hypoactive sexual desire disorder, you have hypoarousal disorders, and there's orgasmic disorders. So and you're not supposed to deviate from this model no matter what the context is. So you had a really bad day and you still don't have desire. Well, it doesn't really matter. You're supposed to have desire. So there's something wrong with you that we need to work out. So because this model really relies more on intra-psychic factors rather than context, I would really suggest that spontaneous desire is not as typical for fat women. I do not think that if we were to do research on that, but of course this is speculative and maybe anecdotal from my experiences, that this model would not likely be a very useful model in working with fat individuals. But we have another model. Thank goodness. Female researchers started to get into the game, and in 2000 we got Rosemary Basson, another Canadian researcher, who came out with a more circular model that was much more about context. This model also, through the research, seems to fit better for females overall in general, rather than males. So this might end up being probably more helpful as a model in working with fat individuals or couples. Because even some of, from my research there about the buffers, so we know that there's going to be perhaps some negative drivers, not always, but some negative drivers for sociocultural reasons. And then some of these contextual factors are going to be related to that. And there might need to be this need for these as to be very emphasized, to be the buffers in order to have sexual receptivity. So, for example, like emotional intimacy being a part of this. Well, if you don't really feel like your partner accepts you for your body and your shape, partly because maybe you don't, then it's going to be very difficult to feel emotionally intimate and vulnerable enough to be able to go into some of these sexual spaces. It might feel like I'd rather not do this. I would rather not have to work through all of the vulnerability and emotional parts of this to get to something better. And so a withdrawal response could be from that. But I would really suggest that this would be the model that would need to be worked with more when we're working with fat people. The dual control model. So this comes out of Bancroft. Michael Perlman is kind of keeping this research alive as well. And it's really the idea that we have this balancing effect that's happening in our context that is going to determine whether or not we tip towards a sexual response or we tip away from a sexual response. And those are based on the factors of what turns us on, what our accelerators are, and how that relates to the brakes, what turns us off and what pulls us away from sexuality. And trying to ultimately, for clients, we're trying to maximize those accelerators and we're trying to minimize those brakes. So maximizing those accelerators, what does that mean for fat sex? What are the accelerators? Might they be different than what culture tells us we are supposed to be turned on by, or what women are supposed to be turned on by? So they might be different. There might be some differences in terms of accelerators that occurs there, as well as brakes, because there's potentially a lot of brakes that are going on around inhibiting oneself to go towards vulnerable experiences, and sexuality being one of the most vulnerable experiences we can have. So a lot of pressure, stress, performance anxiety, maybe a lot more body monitoring that's also happening that are going to prevent a presence around pleasure. Because the more you're worried about all of these things, the more that, you know, what's this going to be? What's that going to be? What does this look like? How does that feel? Takes us away from the reasons that we really want to connect sexually. And those reasons are not, they're not just physical. And yet that's kind of how sexuality has been represented in our society. So it becomes much more about the physical components than what might really be necessary is the emotional safety, the taking away the pressure, the performance anxiety, the expectations of what it's supposed to look like, right? And moving it into something that's more based on what do you want as an individual? What do you want? Not what you think you want, what you've been told you want, what the cultural appropriateness of your gender or what you look like and what you want is. But what do you actually want? Instead of following a role, following your own intimacy, following what it really means for oneself to be turned on or to be turned off, and embodying that, moving that into a space where you can communicate those wants and needs with a partner, or even just thinking about it for oneself and feeling acceptance around that. So the dual control model, I think, would be very, very important to name the breaks, naming the breaks in this system of cultural messages, parental messages, the idea that nobody wants to see fat people having sex or in any kind of relational dynamic. And so they're hidden away from the mainstream of society, which suggests that it's not what society wants, or it's not acceptable. And naming those things in terms of the brakes, and then also shifting over towards the accelerators to say, okay, well, how do you in your body find a sense of attractiveness? How do you find a sense of confidence? Can we explore it in those ways? Or maybe there's other ways that are going to be helpful to explore it in too. These are just some of the things that are coming out of my study. Next, so closeness and separateness. So this is really coming out of Esther Perel's first major publication, Mating in Captivity, which I think was back in 2007 now. And her, really, this is another dual control model where we need to understand and express what our feelings are and where we want to be around this continuum of feeling really close and connected to a partner, as well as the interplay of feeling independent, feeling some sense of separateness, that you're not completely absorbed in the closeness of the relationship, that you're still maintaining your own sense of self. And so this is another area to apply or to attempt to apply some fat sex principles into. Separateness might be more comfortable based on some of the avoidant attachment correlations that we're seeing. And what does that mean? That means we really need to respect that person's need for separateness. We're not going to try and convince them like, oh, you have to go towards closeness here. That's way better. You're going to love it. Nothing but closeness. No, that's misguided. That's what Esther Perel, David Schnarch have taught us. The pathway is not always through closeness. Sometimes the pathway is around feeling like you're your own person. And that might also be why it wasn't correlated what the partner's responsiveness was for fat sex. It was the individual's sense. So it was their separateness that actually was the pathway towards their desire and their sexuality. So that may be something to think about, to work with these clients, but really having a high regard for their need for separateness, because that has probably been what has protected them and kept them safe. And so we really want to honor and value the body's urge to do that, and not criticize it. Because I think that on a large part of society, the emphasis still remains to move towards closeness always as the intervention or as the pathway. And that just does not, it works sometimes, but it does not always work. So we need to be careful of that.